Last Friday night, an inconceivable sin aired live on ESPN. This was a very serious violation of the first woke commandment: thou shalt not commit mythical racism. This violation caused emotional pain for the few 100,000 people who were watching the game between Army and UTSA. Now, those who tuned in to see the amateur athleticism on the field between two college football teams who, let's be honest here, no one cares about outside of San Antonio and West Point. Those who tuned in to see a football game, they were also exposed to blatant racism. Those who tuned in patiently waiting for ESPN to excite the woke boner, they were ultimately disappointed when those boners became flaccid. Just like they did with the game between Colorado and Colorado State, ESPN, they had their premier broadcast crew calling the game between Army and UTSA. Ware and Anish Shroff. Who and who? I have no idea. I've never heard of either one of them. I think Ware used to play in the NFL, but he was well before my time. When it comes to college football, I only watch the games that matter, which is why I have never heard of Anish Shroff. During the third quarter, Army, they ran a trick play where they pitched to the running back. He sweeps right like he's going to cut the angle up the field, but he ends up throwing the deep ball. While calling the action on the field, Anish Shroff, he decided to use some painful terminology that automatically convicted him of violating the first woke commandment, which, as you guys know, violating the first woke commandment, that carries the death penalty for your media career, where you will spend eternity rotting in the woke cemetery. While describing this trick play by Army, Anish Shroff, he claimed that Army was using guerrilla tactics. Apologize for not censoring the painful language. I know it is very triggering to hear those words. I'm going to give you guys a moment to gather yourself and take control of your emotions. Obviously, Anish Shroff, he was immediately pulled from the broadcast and fired by ESPN, right? Well, Casey, why would you say that? He didn't do anything wrong. You cannot look at this situation through the logic of a normal person. In order to properly diagnose this situation, we must utilize the services of the woke cat. Oh God, it's been a while since I've worn this thing. All right. Now that we have our woke hats applied, we can now view this situation through the mind of a shit fuck. Now, I didn't check the roster demographics of Army and UTSA, but that's okay because we're wearing the woke hat here, which means we are not allowing those pesky facts to get in the way of pushing our agenda. I think we can safely assume that there was an abundance of melanin on the field during this game Friday night. The vast majority of the players in this game, they were black. Ware, broadcast partner of Anish Shroff, he's also black. Anish Shroff is not black, but he is a minority. Here we have Anish Shroff describing a play that was run by a group of young black players and calling it guerrilla tactics. Now, this is a classic case of mythical racism, right? I mean, you can't use the word guerrilla when describing an athletic play by young black players. That's dangerous. That's verbal abuse. Now, I know it sounds ludicrous since the term gorilla in this context has absolutely nothing to do with referencing the animal, but like I said, facts do not matter. This is an open and shut case of mythical racism. All right, let's go ahead and remove that stupid woke cat. All right. Obviously, Anish Shroff fired by ESPN, right? Let me ask you something. Before I shared this with you, how many of you guys had heard about this story? How many of you had seen the countless media articles calling for Anish Shroff to be fired? I would be willing to bet none of you knew about this, and for good reason. The mainstream media didn't pick up the story. ESPN didn't fire Anish Shroff for a clear violation of the woke commandments. And you know what? They shouldn't have. He didn't do anything wrong. At 41 years old, he doesn't deserve to have his career ended because he used the term guerrilla tactics to describe a play in a college football game. But how come this same logic was not used 6 years ago with Doug Adler? January 2017, Doug Adler, he's calling the Australian Open for ESPN. Venus Williams was competing against some unknown tennis player. At one point during the match, Doug Adler, he's describing the action on the court and he says, Venus is all over her, and you'll see Venus move in and put the gorilla effect on, charging her. That was it. That was it. Doug Adler, he was describing the play of Venus Williams in a positive way. For a few minutes, everything was all good. The match continued. No one in attendance at the Australian Open had to receive medical attention for their exposure to mythical racism. Everyone took the comment for what it was, a compliment. Everybody moved on. Well, almost everyone. Back in New York City, there was a miserable, lonely they-them watching the Australian Open wanker in hand. He was searching through the crowd in his television looking for other lonely theys that he could search for on Grindr. Upon hearing this comment from Doug Adler, this mountain of misery started to experience convulsions. After falling to the dirt floor of his rent-by-the-hour apartment, shaking uncontrollably for several minutes, he finally gathers his bearings and got on Twitter. Like all parishioners of Woke United Methodist, he wanted to share his misery with the world. With his tweet, he notified ESPN that Doug Adler had called Venus Williams a gorilla. Now, obviously, this was bullshit. This dude could not have been further away from the truth if his name was Keith Olbermann. Keithy Poo! Keithy Poo! What does ESPN do? Do they look at this tweet and recognize it for what it really is? Some lonely dude sitting in his apartment frantically searching for something to offend him? Some lonely dude begging for attention? No and no. I'm sure you guys know that broadcasters calling live sporting events, they have an earpiece in their ear. Management at ESPN, they contact Doug Adler through his earpiece. They demand that he apologize live on the air for his remark. Now at this point, Doug Adler, he should have said, fuck off. But in fairness to him, hindsight is 2020. I mean, this happened back in 2017. This happened before ESPN was flaunting their dedication of Wiener to the public. Doug Adler, he did what he was told. He apologized. Case closed, right? Unfortunately for Doug Adler, he was not as lucky as Anish Shroff. The mainstream media ignoring Anish Shroff for making the exact same comment. He got lucky. Back in 2017, they did not ignore Doug Adler. He was wrongfully labeled a racist throughout the media. He was accused of using a racial slur against Venus Williams. Now, never mind the fact that Doug Adler, he was going to black neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., teaching young black kids how to play tennis. And this was not some paid-for tennis camp. This was Doug Adler volunteering his free time to help young black children learn the game of tennis. Now, you think that mattered to ESPN and the mainstream media? No. Why would they let facts get in the way of pushing their narrative? This was a perfect case of mythical racism. Older white man using the word gorilla when describing a black woman. Instead of ESPN defending their employee against the bullshit, instead of ESPN coming out and saying, we're all adults here, we all know what Doug Adler meant by his comment. They do the complete opposite. They fire him. ESPN not only fired him, they doubled down on the claim of mythical racism. Now, Doug Adler, he ended up filing a lawsuit against ESPN for wrongful termination. ESPN, they released a statement that said, Doug Adler is misrepresenting the facts and the world's reaction. We fired him because he made a comment that was offensive to everyone but Doug Adler. Oh, really? Who was offended? One doofus working for the New York Times? Who, by the way, the New York Times, they never printed a story on this. Why? Because even they knew this was garbage. Now, it's been over 6 years, and to my knowledge, Doug Adler, he has never worked in the media again. He had a heart attack that was stress related because he was incorrectly labeled a racist. At 56 years old, Doug Adler, his media career was over, all because ESPN was afraid to stand up to one employee from the New York Times. One doofus ruined the life and career of Doug Adler. Well, actually, you know what? That's not entirely true. ESPN ruined the life and career of Doug Adler. I don't blame the doofus. He's just doing his job. He's paid to be offended, and that's exactly what he did. I hold ESPN responsible for this. They should have had the courage to take a stand and defend Doug Adler. And here's another thing. By doing this, ESPN set a dangerous precedent. Doug Adler was fired for using the word gorilla. So how come Anish Shroff wasn't fired for doing the exact same thing? Did ESPN let him slide because he's a minority and Doug Adler is white? Well, KC, maybe ESPN learned from their mistake. Maybe that's why they let this slide. This is a good thing. Yeah, if you believe that, I've got a set of VIP tickets to sell you for the upcoming Butt Bongo Festival, brought to you by Club Shay Shay. If ESPN was so sensitive to potential racism, how come they are still donating woke welfare to Mark Jones? Who? Mark Jones! Mark Jones! Not only does ESPN continue to donate woke welfare to this insufferable fuck, they actually gave him a raise. They actually increased his woke welfare and are requiring him to do less work, which is great for guys like me who watch the NBA but can't stand to hear the commentary from Mark Jones. Mark Jones is the worst kind of offender because Mark Jones, he is a pretend racist. He makes comments pretending to be against white people because he thinks it gives him street cred. This dude was absolutely crucified on social media last weekend during the Colorado State game. Throughout the game, he was pandering to the black community and they were outright rejecting him, which is fine for Mark Jones since, he's used to being rejected. He once approached a mannequin at Club Shay Shay asking for a VIP dance. The mannequin responded by falling over and playing dead. Mark Jones has given ESPN dozens of reasons to fire him. Bobby Burek over at Outkick, he has compiled a list of I'd say about 20, maybe 30 instances where Mark Jones should have been fired by ESPN. And all these occurrences, they happened on social media. This list, it doesn't even take into consideration that Mark Jones is the worst broadcaster in the history of broadcasting. Yet for some reason, ESPN afraid to fire him. I wonder why. Doug Adler loses his job, his reputation destroyed, and he did nothing wrong, while the list of transgressions with Mark Jones continues to grow and he gets a raise. If that's not racial hypocrisy, I don't know what is. But you give me your thoughts. ESPN fired Doug Adler back in 2017 for using the word gorilla, but they let it slide with Anish Shroff. Why do you think that is? Is this a sign of progress and growth at ESPN, or did they let it slide because no one in the mainstream media picked up the story? I think it's the latter. Also, Mark Jones, worst broadcaster in the history of broadcasting. If you don't agree, prove me wrong. Sound off in the comments below. Like, subscribe, share the video. Best way to contact me is by email at btlkc84@gmail.com, KC_BTL84 on Twitter. I'll see you guys tomorrow.